start a little early here. Very good. There's a lot of energy in the room. Now, Dr. Carl Wieman will be talking to us. We have the room until 5:15, so we're going to go, and he's going to talk, and we'll have time for questions through 5:15, and that's when then we'll need to leave the room and be excused at that time. As I said, I would like to give him the most amount of time to talk about his work, as it's near and dear, I think, to our hearts here at Sonoma State. And as I often do, I wax poetically about things as introductions, and I'll keep that to a minimum. I just want to say that Dr. Carl Wieman is somebody who, without even looking at my notes here, we know from his tremendous contributions to atomic physics. It's in his lab with Eric Cornell that they made the first Bose-Einstein condensate. So this is rare materials, a new form of matter, and for which his work won the Nobel Prize. He is, though, someone who has, in a way that resonates with me, in his time he has found that science education and bettering the way we convey science to students, undergraduate, graduate students, is of tremendous importance. So he was at the University of Colorado for his Nobel Prize work in between 84 and 2006 as a distinguished professor and presidential teaching scholar. It's there that he founded PhET, the Physics Education Technology. This is something that I use day in and day out to go and get animations and interactive assignments to work with students. He was the director of the Science Education Initiative there. He took that work as a part-time appointment, part at Colorado and part at University of British Columbia, to start the Carl Wieman Science Education Initiative there. And later, very recently, has returned to Stanford, where he got his PhD, where he's professor of physics and a professor in the Graduate School of Education. He recently served as the Associate Director for Science in the White House Office of Science and Tech Policy. I cannot tell you how thrilled I am and how thrilled we are, and let's show that to Dr. Carl Wieman.
Okay, well, thank you. See how well this multimedia presentation works here. I can see all of you nicely, so I can tell when you're falling asleep, and I'll try and speed up then. If you have any trouble hearing me, since I obviously don't get much feedback from the room, just kind of raise your hand and wave, and I'll know that means I gotta talk louder. If you want to interrupt me with questions, that's a little hard, so over the video though. So I'm going to talk about really taking a scientific approach to science education and what we've learned from that. But before I start, I want to sort of give you a sense of how I came to think about this in this way and do this kind of work. When I was first called upon to teach physics, starting 40 or so years ago, I would start out think about teaching the same way most people do, I think, which is I'd get the subject all figured out in my own mind clearly, and so that I could tell the students and they understand it the same way I did. But I've always been pretty good about experimentalist, at collecting data on things. And what I found was that it was clear, my brilliantly clear explanations were leaving almost all the students baffled, and my colleagues, I had looked at their students, they weren't doing much better. So for a long time, many years, this was just kind of a frustrating fact of life, kind of like the weather. You might not like it, but there wasn't anything you could do about it. At least that's what I thought. But what really changed me in thinking about this, 25 years ago or so, was actually not looking at my teaching in the classroom, but was actually working with my graduate students doing atomic physics research. And what I came to see was there was really quite a curious puzzle, which was that these students would come out of, they didn't get to work in my lab unless they'd been very successful many years in math and science classes. But when they got into the lab to do physics, even though they got A's in all these physics courses, they were really pretty clueless about what to do. But after just a couple years working with me, they turned into expert physicists. They were winning arguments with me all the time. And so, initially this just seemed like a curious thing about individuals, but over the years I had enough students and it's really, there's a real pattern there. There's something fundamental going on, and there's a real question. And so I tackled this just like I would a physics problem. I started looking at what the research had been done on how people learn, particularly on how they learn physics. And it made me realize that there was a completely different way to think about teaching and learning physics, which is I could approach this in the same way I did a physics problem, and I could do research on it, and I could look at other people were doing research on it, where they, were doing carefully controlled experiments, and they were looking at data on how different things work. And this worked particularly well in university science classrooms. And so, for many years, actually, 20 or so, I had two parallel research groups, one doing atomic physics and one doing science, particularly physics education research work. And I'll give you, before I go into more general what this involved, I'll give you just a little appetizer to show you what kinds of things we could find out in taking this kind of more scientific approach. This was an experiment looking at the amount of learning that students really took away just from the classroom. And so we got a very large introductory physics class with multiple sections of 250 students each, and we carefully measured to show that they were really nearly identical. And then we had these two sections to cover the same material in the class in exactly the same class time, and then given a common test on this material right after the lectures on it. And the comparison was between one of these sections was taught by somebody who was a very experienced professor teaching this material many times with high student ratings. And the other one was taught by somebody who was a new PhD in physics, but had been trained in these scientific principles and methods of scientific teaching. And so when they had this week of lectures and then this test, here's the results that came in on the tests. And you can see here that the experienced professor, with the test scores versus number of students, the histograms here, the scientific teaching approach is just profoundly better, much higher distribution here. Now, so hopefully it's convince you maybe there's something going on here. This is somebody who, the traditional teacher is, by the standards of this university and most universities, would be considered a good teacher, and yet clear that their students are learning much less. And so the rest of my talk is really to have you understand why results like that aren't very surprising, based on research that's over the past few decades from 3 different areas: the cognitive psychologists who study how people think and learn at the basic level, brain research, and university classroom science, things like I do. As all these fields are coming together to give us a nice, consistent, coherent understanding of what's necessary for achieving learning of complex things, like learning like a physicist. And so what I'm going to talk about is to go through this, starting out with the idea of what do I mean when I say thinking like a scientist? Because I would argue that in most of our science courses, that's the primary educational goal. We don't want to turn all the students into science. I mean, heaven forbid you have thousands and thousands of physicists running all over the planet. But what we do want to do, if you think about sort of the goal of the course, it's to have the students think about the material and how to use the material, much like a scientist in that field would. And so, by that, sort of how would they make decisions at the appropriate level based on that? And so, after I sort of dig into what that means and what we know about that, then I'll talk a little about what the research tells us about how it's learned. And those two parts, that's really the cognitive psychology part of the talk. And then I'll go into how this applies in college classrooms, some of the studies we and others have done on thinking effectiveness. So cognitive psychologists have done lots of studies about what makes up expertise or expert thinking across a whole bunch of different fields, whether it's chess players, musicians, scientists, historians, etc. And they find out that there's certain basic components of expert thinking that apply in all of these different fields. And they also find that there's a very specific way that expertise is actually learned that's independent of field. So, okay, so what are the basic components of thinking like an expert in some field? Well, the first one everybody could guess. Experts have a whole bunch of factual knowledge about their discipline, but the others aren't nearly as obvious. The second is that in any specific discipline, there's a very specific to that discipline way to organize all of that knowledge. And so that in some, an expert in the field is working on a problem, they can very effectively retrieve and apply the information they need and not get sidetracked with things that are irrelevant. And so these mental organizational frameworks involve looking and organizing the material around certain complex patterns and relationships. And much of what we talk about is a scientific concept, is really the way, experts in the field, scientists in the field, have taken a whole bunch of different pieces of information and seen how they can organize it all together, and so that then they can very quickly sort through whether that's going to be useful to them or not, but that concept. The third aspect of expert thinking is the ability to monitor their thinking. And so, scientists, engineers, when they're working on a problem, they've got a little voice in the back of their head that's sort of asking, do you really understand this? Is this a sensible way to be solving this problem? And they have other little voices that can then answer and tell them, yeah, it's okay, keep working on it. Or, nah, this doesn't seem to be working. You should step back and maybe try a different approach, okay? So what the research shows is that all of these are fundamentally new ways of thinking. Nobody's born with these capabilities, and they require many hours, actually, to reach a very high level of expertise, many thousands of hours of intense practice to actually develop these capabilities. And what brain research is telling us now is, in fact, this limit that everybody takes so much time to become, in a field to become expert, is fundamentally biological. The process of this kind of intense practice is actually really rewiring the brain. So, the expert brain has fundamentally changed from what that brain was when it started out as an undergraduate. And so this is a very different way to think about learning. It's not taking a brain and filling up with knowledge. It's really giving it practice so that the neurons hook up in different ways, and within those connections lie the necessary expertise. Now, what the research also shows is that there's very specific kind of practice that's needed to develop that thinking. And it has to involve challenging but not impossible tasks. And they've really got to practice the right kinds of thinking that you want. And so, in fact, it turns out that a very good analogy, in fact, it's almost better than analogy, is to look at muscle development. That in just the same way, if I want to build up this muscle, I have to use it very strenuously, pushing it to the limit and doing that over and over again. And in response to that, the body says, oh, okay, I got to make that muscle bigger and stronger. It does much the same thing with the brain. When it's really focused intently on things, chemicals are dumped in there to build up the neuron connections that make it better at doing these specific kinds of tasks it's being called on. So it's got to be hard, it's got to, but not impossible. And it really has to be practicing just the things that it needs to learn. But in addition, with the brain, it's not just a practice trying to figure out hard things. Or do hard things. There's got to be feedback, and so that the learner can adjust what they're doing based on that guidance to get better. And so that's sort of very abstract. I'll slowly get more and more specific here. If you then say, well, what kind of things does it have to be getting practice thinking about? So some of the things that are general across science and engineering fields that map on any particular one is, experts in that field have a set of conceptual or mental models that they use when they're confronting a problem. But more importantly, they have selection criteria by which they decide which of these models would apply in a certain case and which wouldn't. They also have sort of patterns that tell them what information is going to be needed to solve a kind of problem and what's going to be irrelevant. And so they can sort of filter on what's important. They have ways to test if the answer makes sense. When they get an answer, if it makes sense or there might be a better way to do it. And these test criteria, they're very specific to the discipline, so in microbiology, they're going to look very different from atomic physics. But the fact that in both those fields, if you look carefully, there will be a very specific set of, when people get an answer, they'll run through a bunch of checks that they'll use to make sure it's all right. And then every field has a set has certain specialized representations that they use for representing information. And when working on problems, they're able to move through these different representations to give them new insights on ways to figure things out. So these are the kind of elements that have to be built into the practice thinking and the tasks that the learner has to be doing to develop expertise. Now, I didn't say anything here about knowledge or particular areas of content, which is, of course, what most of the discussion in education, usually curriculum, we're supposed to cover these specific things. But the reality is that researchers like me and others have plenty of evidence that people can learn specific information but have no idea how to use it and don't call on it when they need it. And so knowledge is really important, but it's really useful only if it's integrated with these other, more specific aspects of expert thinking that tell them when to use that knowledge. So that's really what the learner has to be doing. And so then when asked, well, so what's the role of the teacher in this? Well, the role of an effective teacher, they've got to be thinking about what's the right practice task, that's really explicitly giving practice and expert thinking, that's at the right level for the learners in the class, right level of challenge. They've got to be giving them and useful guiding feedback as the learners work through these tasks, feedback on how to get better. And since this is inherently hard work, if it's not hard work, your brain isn't working hard enough to learn in a serious way. Because it's hard work, then you have to be a good teacher is motivating the students on why this is worthwhile, and so to put in that necessary effort. So if you sort of think about it, teach it this way, you realize this is exactly what a good athletic coach does. And so I like to sort of think that a good science teacher is really the cognitive equivalent to a good athletic coach. And I'll just sort of mention that, you also, if you think about what's involved in doing any of these things, you realize you can't really teach a subject effectively because you can't carry out these sort of components unless you really understand the subject well. You understand what it means to think like a physicist if you're going to teach others to do that. Okay, so let me move quickly along into how do you apply these ideas in the classroom? That was sort of, the general basic research. Now let's get into and see what you do this in the classroom. And so I'm going to give you the example of how to do it in a big, giant introductory physics class like this. Say I was teaching about electricity and current and voltage. So before the class starts, the students will be given this very targeted reading assignment. And I don't expect them to really understand the subject on this, but it sort of moves the basic information transfer and doesn't waste class time on this. So the basic phenomena and terminology they can get just as better by reasoning or by reading than they can by listening to a lecture. Give them a little online quiz to check that they get it rewarded for them. And then class doesn't have to start with me just giving information. It can start with questions or problems. And so in this subject, I've given the students, for example, with a circuit with these light bulbs and a battery here, and ask them when I close that switch, what's going to happen to the brightness of that light bulb. And in a big class like this, it's really useful to have every student has a clicker, so they have to answer, and so the computer and therefore I knows what who they were and what answer they chose. Now, as I go around universities, frankly, Stanford in particular, see a lot of really poor use of clickers, and so I want to sort of emphasize what they are and aren't good for. You don't really learn anything from a clicker, but what it does do is it gives the instructor some quick feedback, but more importantly, it has the students have to commit to an answer that they have some level of accountability for. And when you're doing that, you just have to, everybody, it's basic psychology, you think much more intently about the subject, and you're much better primed to then subsequently learn about it. And the learning takes place then in the subsequent processes. And so in this example, what I do is I don't show the students the answer, don't show them how they voted. I just have all of them, they then are part of consensus groups. And so each 3 adjacent students, for example, would then have to talk to each other, decide what the answer was and why, and re-vote. And while they're doing that, I'm running around listening in on those conversations. So I'm getting little snapshots of what's going on in those students' brains, and so how they're thinking like I want, or how they're thinking erroneously. And so then I can give them better feedback later. So then, after they've talked as groups and voted, then I can show the result and have a follow-up summary where I give them guidance on what aspects of their thinking was correct, but more importantly, what was incorrect and why, and so what they need to change to improve. A very common error of teachers is they'll ask students some questions, students will get it wrong, and so the teacher then goes and says, no, you're wrong, here's the right way to think about it. Okay? One of the things I've learned from the cognitive psychologists is that doesn't really do very much for learning. The learning really takes place when instead you have the person understand not just that they were wrong, what aspect of their thinking was wrong, and then how they can change it to do better. And that's really what makes a difference. Okay, when you're teaching this way and you get to this, then there are many, many more student questions. They dig into the material and they expand on what material you cover and get it more deeply. And so that's sort of then the way the class would proceed. Now, to get back to my original point, so how are the students getting practice and feedback on this thinking like physicists? Well, they're first, you think about this problem and deciding what information is relevant and irrelevant in that problem. They have to think about it, and test their conceptual model of how electricity works, how it flows, and then they have to be practice evaluating their own thinking and testing thinking of the others through their trying to convince other students or trying to decide if other students are correct in their arguments. While they're doing that, they're getting multiple immediate forms of feedback to guide their thinking, both from the discussions with other students, seeing how their prediction compared to what actually happened, and most importantly, getting the feedback from this, for me, the now very highly informed instructor, because I've been listening in on those conversations. So that's basically how you're putting in place in the classroom what the cognitive psychologists tell you is essential for this kind of learning. So how well does it work? Well, let me show you some data on doing experiments, some of which I've done, some of others, on comparing the learning that takes place, teaching with these approaches versus this standard kind of lecture approach. So this is an example from actually Cal Poly, and I like it because it looked at many different instructors across many sections, and it had them all teach one way and then teach a different way and compared how the students learned. So this was introductory physics, and so they looked at how well there's some standard tests for probing, how well students can think like physicists in applying this basic concepts of force and motion covered in this class to correctly predict what's going to happen in some simple real-world situations like cars running into trucks. So they collected data on this for a number of years, and they saw their average was about 0.3 of this material students mastered that they didn't know coming in. That's pretty standard for a well-taught introductory physics course that's taught using lectures. We have lots of data on that. Then they changed to this, what they call the studio approach. It was much like what I talked about in smaller sections, so that the students worked in, had worksheets where they would work out and use clickers. They wrote things down on paper using, working in groups to work through these, while the instructors then acted as coaches or facilitators as they worked through these problems. And when they used the same test to then measure this conceptual mastery, basically the average just doubled overall, and really everybody moved up into a much higher level here. And it's really quite striking that what you have here is that the same instructors simply using different teaching methods, and the students are across the board learning much more from this. So it says it's really the method that matters, nothing about the instructor's personality and jokes and etc. And I mean, this example shows you how dramatically different. I mean, this instructor, their students are learning about a factor 6 more than they were before they changed their teaching approach. Here's an example It's actually different fields, computer science, and much bigger courses, but this is someone, Beth Simon at UC San Diego, who took the same approaches we tested in physics, applied them to the core computer science courses, along with the 3 other instructors who taught that. And they looked at the drop in failure rates from those courses, and they could see, and across the board, they dramatically decreased. And so now with these same instructors, they're getting about 1/3 the drop in failure rates that in their core computer science courses they used to have before. And so this is many more students now able to successfully pursue careers in computer science. Let me then go back to a little more detail, the one I introduced before. The 2 studies that I showed earlier and most of the research in this field quite appropriately look at the learning that takes place over an entire course, entire semester, quarter. But that involves not just the learning that happens in the classroom, but of course, what happens in homework and studying for exams, et cetera, where arguably most of the learning takes place. And so we were interested in part, 2 questions really we wanted to get at. First, looking at just what happens in the classroom, because that's what most faculty pay most attention to. And secondly, we wanted to test, could you cover, if you're trying to cover the same amount of material, because a lot of the concern with taking these methods is, well, instructors won't be able to cover nearly as much material. So that was what led us to pick these 2 sections, and as I mentioned before, one of them taught the standard lecture approach, one of them taught with somebody who was a new PhD, and my program actually trained them in these methods and principles of scientific teaching. And they covered exactly the same set of learning objectives and exactly 1 week of class lectures, and they jointly prepared an exam that tested them, the students on these objectives. And so the experimental class design was just the sort of things I showed you, targeted pre-class readings, and then during class they had questions to solve. Some of them were clicker type questions, others were worksheets where they had to write, still a great big lecture class, but they would write things down and talk to their neighbors about what they were doing. Worksheets are a lot easier for a lot of computational things where you want to be able to write equations and such. And then the instructor would see what they were doing and then have follow-up discussion. And so that's what produced this sort of histogram that I showed before. Now, the difference in the learning between these 2 sections is actually bigger than you probably would have thought just looking at this, because to make this as objective as possible, we made it a fairly carefully developed multiple choice test. And so just random guessing on average would give a student 3. And so you really sort of have to look at the measure of learning as how far above 3 the students are. And by that measure, you can see that the learning in the traditional lecture course is really very small, and that's consistent with lots of other data that I've taken in my own lectures and others, and compared to what's obtained in the active learning course. This also makes the point that I think it's the entire distribution moved up. So a lot of times people say, well, are these methods just better for weaker students or stronger students? And this sort of data shows you that no, it's really better for every student with a human brain. This is where the human brain learns, and so the whole distribution is higher here. Now, we measured various other things like engagement. No surprise, the students were vastly more engaged in the class in which they're having to solve problems and figure things out than just sitting there listening. Now, that work and most of the work, to be honest, in sort of research and science education has primarily focused on these introductory courses because they're larger. That's where most of the students are. But I've been working with others on applying these ideas to more advanced courses, and so I want to just say a little about that, showing how it works there as well. We started doing some of this work at University of British Columbia, and there's a paper written on this on a fourth-year course, but now a whole bunch of the Stanford physics courses across the physics majors curriculum have started using these ideas. And so the design in these courses is, again, the students do a little bit of pre-class preparation to get basic information. And then in these kind of advanced physics courses, it's almost all done with worksheets. They're working just in this picture here. They've got things they're writing down, working in small groups, and the instructors are distributed around there, help working out. And then the homework is basically building on this work they do in class. And so, again, looking at data on how well this works, the UBC course, we had some particularly challenging but quite authentic sort of problems that a physicist would encounter with this material. And so they put this on the exams in slightly different forms each year, some of these problems. And basically, after the class had been really pretty well-refined lecture, the students were down here, and then when it changed to this kind of practice and feedback, students jumped up to here, and then another instructor took over teaching the same way and even got a little better. This is about a full standard deviation improvement, which is a heck of a big change, actually, kind of, just the learning you can get if you change the teaching. So that was work at UBC. Then we have this whole series, bunch of physics courses now, just in the last few years. A bunch of Stanford faculty have changed to start teaching this way in these different courses across the curriculum. And we haven't looked in a lot of detail at the learning comparisons. One of the really striking features, though, is that the attendance in these courses is way up from what it used to be. Surprisingly, Stanford students pay lots and lots of money for courses and then realize they learn better if they don't bother going to lecture, but now teaching this way, they decide there's some value, and so they're getting something more for their money. It's interesting to see all of these instructors found they could cover as much or even more material than they were before, and the student response was extremely positive. I was quite struck by just how strong the positive comments were. Many of them saying, gee, how come all our courses, our physics courses aren't taught this way, and very few negative comments. And also, all the instructors really found this a much more rewarding way to teach, and they felt that it's much more intellect. They're using their expertise and interacting much more, transferring that to students in a much more effective way. And this is something that we actually have seen across these science education initiatives that I led at Colorado and British Columbia, and to change entire departments. So we have many, many science faculty teaching this way. We also see this very strong preference by the faculty once they've experienced it in teaching with these methods. So they improve student learning and faculty enjoyment. Just want to say a little bit about the research I'm doing right now. In finishing up here. So, we have the basic methods. We sort of see, okay, these are much better than lectures, but there's still a great deal to be learned on the kind of best kinds of activities and practice to give students and the best feedback to help them learn most effectively. And so, some of the research we're doing right now is trying to bring invention activities into the science and hopefully some engineering courses where what you're doing is, rather than just giving problems to students problems to solve, we're basing it on Dan Schwartz's cognitive psychology work of the value of actually giving students carefully designed problems they don't know how to solve, that they haven't had the background on, and they can start working on them first. And even though they can't solve the problem, the process of thinking about struggling with it first actually prepares them much better to learn subsequently if you structure things right. So we're developing some of these cases, testing them in physics courses here. We're working on introductory physics labs where we've done some research showing that they're remarkably ineffective for students learning anything, and shocking actually to see. But now we're figuring out ways to make those courses more effective to actually have students learn things from them. And then finally, we've been doing a lot of work on basic problem-solving strategies and looking at analyzing what makes up a good and versus bad problem-solving strategies in science, and then in the future, having done that analysis, find out ways to measure students' strengths and weaknesses. We want to then do much more targeted teaching to see if we can improve general strategies for solving problems. So I see that I met my target of getting done quickly here. So leaving time for questions before I get kicked out of the room. So I'll just, finish with this, hopefully giving you some inspiration that there's more, that the way we've been teaching for the last 2,000 years at universities, there's actually a better way to do it, using a sort of scientific approach. Here are some of my favorite references at the top on the subject, and then there's lots more details on the CWSEI website here of shorter references for faculty and students on more effective learning. And I've already set my slides, so I've seen people scribbling down notes here about the available of you websites without trying to copy the URLs here. So thank you.
Well, we have.
So you better orchestrate the questions. It's a little hard for me to get people out from here.
I thought I would, and we'll try with the first question to see if the person speaks up, whether we can have you respond directly or whether I need to repeat the question.
Okay.
All right, shall we begin with questions? Yes?
So you started out the full class, you have a pre-class.
Yeah, I cannot hear that.
Yes. So
you mentioned there's a pre-class reading and test that gives them some reward as to whether or not they understood the pre-class reading. What technology do you use for that?
So did you get it or should I repeat it?
I got it, yeah. So different people use different ways to check the pre-class reading. The most convenient is just simple online little online quizzes, that any course management software can do. It's important to appreciate what's important way to structure the reading. We've done actually a bunch of studies, and we have a paper on how to get everybody, or 85% of them, to consistently do the reading. You need to make the reading very targeted, and so all those extra sections of the textbook that are in there, just the textbooks, you don't have the students, they don't really care, don't have the students do that reading, and then don't expect students to have a deep understanding they can get from the reading. That's just too much to ask for. It's just have a few simple. We usually do simple multiple choice questions that target, quite specific phenomena or what some graph, or figure illustrates that's particularly important there. And so it just kind of makes sure, helps focus their attention, isn't too difficult, and it gets them a little reward and shows it counts for grades. It's students have been so conditioned that grades are what matters. That if you want, what we found is you want them to do something, you have to give them some credit for it, and it makes a world of difference.
Next
But
question.
it doesn't have to be very long or very elaborate at all.
Question? I have one on motivation. Well, I don't know whether it's on motivation or so much as what students can do in their classes. I mean, if you think about this, there are things that the faculty members can do to make their classes more interactive. What should a student be thinking about when they're thinking, I need to get the most out of my class time, I need to get the most out of the instructor. We kind of say this, come to class having read the material and so on, but is there ways for students to put into practice some of these ideas to help them study better?
Yes. So the first thing I would say is don't necessarily read the material before coming to class. Because if the instructor is just going to repeat what was in the textbook, you're wasting your time if you're reading it. And that's one of the essential things about for getting students to read before is don't just sign reading and then just repeat it. But more specifically, the CWSEI website, we have a bunch of specific advice for students out there on the resources page for students. But the things that are always important is to do kind of actively processing the information. And so when you're coming to class and the instructor's talking about things, you want to be actively thinking about, do I understand this? How can I evaluate that understanding? How can I relate this to other material that we've had in class? And most importantly, and this depends on the personality of the instructor, but most importantly is when you don't understand something, or you don't understand why you're thinking about something's wrong, getting the instructor to stop and explain that, and rather than just give you the right answer, say, hey, it seems to me like this is a reasonable way explanation, but that gets the wrong answer. What's wrong with that? So sort of being more active about processing and getting feedback is the essential elements.
Yeah. Question in the front.
Okay, so we've had some interesting classes that we've developed here at Sonoma State for astronomy and cosmology, and we've gotten tremendous amount of pushback from the lower division students that were asked to do all of this extra work and pre-reading and stuff before class. They really just want to be lectured to and shown pretty slides, whereas we've had better luck with the upper division students who are more mature learners and who don't mind coming to class prepared and then discussing items of, confusion with the teacher. So do you have any comments about that?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of concern about student pushback from these teaching methods, and lots of people will raise issues like you did. With the science education issues, we addressed student buy-in in a very explicit way, and I will say, it was overwhelmingly successful. It was completely successful. And there are a few elements that we put in place that we thought were important. The first was you have to have the students not think they're guinea pigs in some experiment that the instructor is doing on them. And so we introduced the first class is really very explicitly talking about why the class is being taught this way, what some of the research is showing, sort of a short version of my talk in some sense, showing why, how the data shows that this is much more effective learning and therefore is being done for their benefit. But it's also important to have the time set to be appropriate. I mean, you know, I strongly advocate that people should monitor the amount of time that students have to spend to be or are spending in their class, and sort of set expectations, agree on expectations up front, and then you monitor how much time students take, because you know, we have seen problems when the instructor starts adding all these extra things they want to do, and it does just take much more time than is really reasonable. Now, you know, there are cases where the institution's gotten sloppy, and so some classes or students can do fine without having to spend any amount of time, and then they wonder why they should have to, you know, spend a lot more time in another course. That's just an institutional problem, but if you can sort of, the institution has reasonable expectations, and then you're monitoring the student's time and you're adjusting them, you know, so you can say, see, everybody only spent 5 hours last week and we agreed on 8, so this is going to be a harder homework assignment, or, oh gee, it took people 11 hours last week, we're going to put that back. And under those circumstances, we've seen general quite effective or quite successful student body, I'd say, at all levels.
Oh, in the third row. That's Ukraine.
Hi, I hope this comes out how I intended. So I had seen a previous talk on science education, although the focus was more pre-college levels, and something that the speaker focused on, among other things, she actually mentioned a lot of the same things as you, but she also mentioned that something that scares a lot of students when they're taking required science courses and keeps them pursuing is things like, you know, imposter syndrome, and this idea that they won't be able to do it or be successful at it because of the idea that it's like a genius field or something. And do you feel that this different way of teaching maybe helps people become more aware of their abilities or anything like that? Or does that make sense?
I got some of that question, but not all of it. Can I get a repeat?
Sorry.
Yeah, one of our physics majors here was talking about having seen a prior talk. This is Karina. She said she'd seen a prior talk. I think she thinks it was geared more towards K through 12 education, but it was talking about imposter syndrome. It was talking about, I think the question is, does your methods, and correct me if I'm wrong, but is there ways that your methods address some of these issues of where students can't see themselves entering in physics because physics is a quote-unquote genius field, and so on?
So the answer is it probably does some. The research is kind of spotty, a little, is limited and uneven on the messages there. What I can say is that, so the methods I was sort of talking about is this kind of practice, active practice, expert thinking and feedback. But there are several other essential components to, and lots of research on learning to make that work effectively. So I think that the collaborative aspect that we usually introduce in that does something for that, but not everything is the answer. And so there's kind of some additional elements that I think are important that to explicitly address the kind of things you're bringing up. And I would lump them into the categories of broad categories of connecting the students' prior learning and also motivation. And because that's where there's a lot of variation in students, and it's a lot of things about learning and motivation to learn that depends on their prior experiences and cultural attitudes and things. And so you really do have to worry about them, and they don't automatically get taken care of with these teaching methods. Things like this, talking about this oftentimes the psychologists talk about mindset, is the belief that, students can have this fixed mindset of, only certain kinds of brains can learn math or science, and what that means is if it starts getting hard, then they say, oh, it's getting hard, I must not have a math brain or a physics brain, and so I should just give up and go do something else. Well, if you do that, then you're pretty guaranteed you're not going to be successful. Whereas if the person has what we psychologists talk about is a growth mindset, that's a mindset of, oh, well, yeah, nobody knows really how to do physics, but anybody can learn to do math or physics if they work hard enough at it, which is really what all the research would say to us, that, other than when you're sort of clinical, distinction. And so somebody has that mindset, then, well, it gets hard. They think, okay, I've got to work harder to be successful. And so those are things that are really critical to people being successful at learning. They need to be addressed. They aren't automatically addressed with these teaching methods. They're part of the aspects that I didn't have time to go into that are still quite important.
Jim here in the front row.
Yeah, I have two questions for you. The first one is, do you think that your pedagogy that you're recommending here lends itself to greater team teaching? If not within the classroom, then perhaps sharing outside the classroom what works and what doesn't work? The second question was, does bulb 2 get brighter when you flip the switch?
Okay, so the second question, I'll let you mention these PhET interactive simulations. You should go run the simulation, build the circuit, and you'll discover yourself what happens to the bulb. So I won't tell you that one. The first question about, does this lend itself to more collaborative teaching? Well, what I would say is it doesn't, the pedagogy doesn't automatically, but I'm not really so much about the pedagogy as the fundamental approach to teaching of let's test what works and do like we do in science. We'll collect data, we'll figure out what works. And in science, we find out what works and we go and copy it, right? And we learn from other scientists how to do things better. And so from that perspective, then there's certainly much more collaboration. People aren't thinking they've got to reinvent everything. They look at who's done something that worked and will copy it and build and advance on it. That's how science research is so successful, and it works the same way with teaching. It's both less work and you do a lot better job that way.
Yes, in the back.
Have you applied this flipped model to both, sugar-based and calculus-based physics, and to see if there's any difference or which one is impacting more?
I need that question repeated.
Have you compared? Have you compared whether this is more effective in calculus-based physics or algebra and trig-based physics? Is that?
Yes.
So, there's been research on all different kinds of physics courses, all different levels, but they also, test. It depends on exactly what's tested, and it depends on exactly what's taught. And so, the quick summary is that it works at every level and every kind of physics course. If you give the students, to the extent they're practicing the kind of thinking and getting feedback on what you want them to learn, that's what they learn. And it doesn't matter if it's algebra-based introductory physics, calculus-based introductory physics, or, second or, junior or senior level quantum mechanics. We've got data from all of those, whereas it's you know, what they practice thinking about, and as explicit and clear as it is, that's what they learn. You know, and different implementations do a better or worse job of that across all of that spectrum as well. So I don't think there's any generalization you can say other than what I just did. If they're going to practice it, they'll learn it better.
Yes, in the front.
I was interested in your comments about how laboratory classes don't really work very well.
Yeah.
And I assume you're referring to cookbook style labs where, you know, people spend 3 hours trying to measure G or whatever. So have you also examined more maker type labs where students have to try to design their own experiments to answer questions, and you know, it might take more than the 3 hour lab period, it might take a few weeks to come up with some kind of solution?
Yes. So you're right on almost all categories. So where we looked and we saw very little, if you look at our American Journal of Physics, it's cookbook labs where students are given a setup, they're given a bunch of steps they're supposed to go through and things they're supposed to measure and analyze, you know, that connect up with the material covered in the introductory physics course, and it's primarily to help them, or intended to help them master the physics material. And what we saw was whether a student took that lab course or not, there was no distinction at the level of 1% in their learning, which is a pretty sensitive measure and pretty shocking that somebody can take an entire class and you can't see a difference of 1% effect. But yeah, and so we've done some other experiments where we've looked at what happens in different kinds of courses, particularly more project courses like you're talking about. And we're able to show, so what we did show was that it's a much richer set of what we talk about as cognitive tasks. There's a much richer set of kinds of thinking and much more authentic set of you know, thinking like a physicist to get practice in those kinds of classes where it's clear that it's quite essential that built into that is an opportunity to you know, be unsuccessful or only partially successful, and then re-examine what you did and troubleshoot it and figure out how to do better. So those kind of levels of time and autonomy and decision making are all critical to having a more effective laboratory experience.
Next question. I wanted to ask about the genesis of your interest in this. You mentioned this when talking about your graduate students. So there's a component of this which is about your research life, but you get bitten by the science education bug, so to speak, and
science education research bug.
Science education research bug. Can you talk about that transition from understand that you have your joint appointments and you have your expertise in atomic physics and the Nobel Prize, but talk about that transition to carving out a whole, at Colorado, this whole new, for you, area of study.
Well, to me, it really wasn't as big a change as most people think. I mean, when working in my research lab, I spent a lot of time having to think about, okay, I want to turn these graduate students into expert physicists because that's the way they'll do better research and make me famous. And so, that's an awful lot of working with graduate students, what you're doing. And the teaching and learning research was really kind of thinking about, okay, how can I apply these ideas in systematic ways? How can I, as I sort of said at the beginning, I came to realize that what we really want students to do is to learn to think more like experts. And so how do we get in the classroom, and how do we do the controlled measurements of how much they are getting practice, how they're thinking, how they're learning from different sorts of classroom educational activities. And so, and a good experiment in physics is, I found, an awful lot like a good experiment in education. And if you really have to think about, you know, especially when you're pushing the forefront of physics, what are the uncontrolled variables here? What are the possible misinterpretations? I'm mostly looking at all the different variables and then thinking about how you design the experiment that's going to be, the results are going to be robust in the presence of not being able to know and control everything. And so that, you know, that shows up in really cutting edge physics a lot the same way it does in good education research, where you can't control what's going on in every student's brain. So for me, there's a lot of overlap with the intellectual activities, and so for many years I just happily did both. And I reached a point where I wanted to launch these giant experiments on changing whole institutions and teaching, and at that point that seemed like a more important thing to do and more unique that I could do than the atomic physics, and when enough time for both. So at that point I shut down my laser, physics lab and just focused on education. That was about 8 years ago.
Very good. More questions? Well, I have one last question, unless someone else comes forward. I had a question about motivation, the role of that. I heard at one point that the students were talking about catchphrases from various professors, and I had heard them, and then I had to know what mine was. What do I say that always sticks in their head that I'm always saying? And apparently, I always say motivate. I'm trying to say, why are we doing the next step that we're doing? And so I long felt that it's key, but I don't have, at least I've not encountered a rule book of ways to motivate this stuff. It is, in the way that we're talking about being science is about it is we're trying things, we're seeing whether it works or not. And obviously you're talking about these pedagogies and what we're doing in the classroom being motivating or not. Is there a broader discussion of motivation than the active learning that you've described?
Yes, there's lots of research on motivation, and I think I've written a little short note on the CWSEI website on this several years ago, but there's sort of three basic things you can say general about motivation. One of them is it's motivating to make sure it connects with students, that they can see why it's interesting or important in terms of their value system, and so that's where when you have students who come in with very different backgrounds, what they might see as interesting or valuable could be quite different. But that's one of the things you've got to do and that usually means finding a way to present them in a context that's meaningful to them, So, frictionless blocks on massless inclined planes is not really too exciting for most people. So you need to kind of put this into some real meaningful, useful thing for learning the material. So that's sort of step one. Another aspect that's really important in motivation is giving them the sense they can learn the material and how to go about learning the material. And that connects up with the earlier question about mindset and sense of belonging that, the student. And so you have to convey to them that they can learn it, how to go about learning, and show them as they progress that they are learning it. And this is one thing that the kind of classic physics midterm that has a nice average of 50 and spreads out all the students wonderfully. It's a really terrible thing. The student studies really, really hard and they get, 60 on a test, and then think, oh my God, I didn't, how can I learn 40% of what I was supposed to? How can I ever master this material? They're not worrying about the fact that, or not thinking about the fact that they still did better than 3/4 of the class on 60. They're thinking about what they failed on. And so those kind of tests can be quite demotivating. And then the other thing and really important part of motivation is having the learner feel that they have some control over the learning process. And, obviously you don't want to turn the class over to them, but to the extent you give them any sense of control, and I mean, these are things that just give your own self on this, that matters, that's motivating. If I can control something about what's happening in the class. So those are sort of 3 very general aspects that the research shows are important for producing motivation.
Thank you. Any more questions? Let's thank our speaker. Thank you very much, Dr. Lee.